A trigger warning that this episode is going to be discussing some serious animal and environmental impacts of overfishing. Some of the content may include graphic descriptions of harm to marine life and ecosystems, which may be upsetting for some listeners. And if you find these topics distressing, it may be best to skip this episode or perhaps listen back with a trusted companion at a time that's convenient for you. And thank you, everybody, for your understanding. So the vast majority of our seas are still unexplored. It's remarkable, really. There's some incredible statistics in this episode that are going to blow your mind. Did you know that there is over 150 million tons of plastic already floating in the sea? And for every pound of tuna that we're taking out to the ocean, we're putting 2 pounds of plastic back in. These types of figures are something that I cannot sit on any longer. Now, avid food for thought listeners will know that I've covered the subjects of plastic before in the oceans. I have covered climate change, animal welfare to a degree, but I feel that time is running out. And if I can use this platform to do some good today, that to me is so important. So I cannot believe we managed to get the incredible Swedish-American Peter Hammarstedt. He's the director of campaigns for Sea Shepherd. So he is the chairman of Sea Shepherd Australia. He is a captain of the ocean-going vessel Bob Barker. And he spent 20 years at sea, including 10 years in Antarctica. And he was telling me on this episode that he joined Sea Shepherd when he was 18. Now, for anyone listening, if you're thinking Sea Shepherd, what's Sea Shepherd? If you've watched the Seaspiracy documentary, you will definitely know that they are the most incredible campaigners for us all. They go out there against all odds in a relatively small boat when it's compared to these huge vessels that are illegally operating in the waters, and they take them on. So I don't really know how to do this intro any more justice than I think you have to listen to this episode. I really hope it has a profound impact on you like it did me. So without a doubt, here we go. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Rhi.
I can't believe you found the time from jumping on and off ships and running the organization to be here today. So first of all, thank you. Let's start by saying, well, let's do a little bit about you. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners firstly in a more eloquent way than I could? And then what got you involved with Sea Shepherd?
Well, first of all, Rhi, it's a great honor for me to be on the podcast. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Peter Hammarstedt. I'm the Director of Campaigns for Sea Shepherd Global. I joined Sea Shepherd when I was 18 years old, which means that I've been working for Sea Shepherd, working with Sea Shepherd my entire adult life and more than half my natural life. The only other job I had was as a barista when I was 16, 17 years old. I started in the engine room as an oiler, keeping our engines running, keeping our ships at sea, and worked my way up the chain of command to captaining our vessels at sea. And what motivated me to join was a really powerful image that I saw when I was 14 years old. It was a picture of a dead whale being pulled up the slipway of an 8,000-ton factory whaling ship operating in the Antarctic. And when I looked into the issue and I discovered that not only was whaling still happening, but it was happening in violation of the law, it was happening in a designated whale sanctuary, I knew that I needed to do something about it. And so as soon as I was old enough to submit an application to join a Sea Shepherd ship as crew, that's what I did.
Wow. So from coffee to saving the animal population or the mammal population as well, everything in the oceans, it's quite remarkable, really. And I know that I only became aware of Sea Shepherd when I watched the Seaspiracy, I'm sure as you hear all the time from many people, documentary. And I didn't realize, like lots of people, how extensive the problems are out there in terms of illegal operations at sea, let alone questioning what is legal that shouldn't be. Where do you even begin? Where do you think, right, we're going to target here next? The ocean's vast and it must be overwhelming.
It's a massive place. 3/4 of the Earth's surface is ocean. And what's happening to marine wildlife happens out of sight and therefore out of mind for most people. These floating slaughterhouses are accessible only by ship, sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles offshore. And that's why I think most people would be surprised to learn that 90% of the world's fisheries are either fully exploited or overexploited, meaning the vast majority of the world's oceans are overfished. And driving that, exacerbating that problem, is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, so-called IUU fishing, which is responsible for 20% of the global catch of fish. That means that 1 out of 5 fish caught is caught illegally.
Wow. Stark figures. And I think for our listeners, just to give you an idea, obviously I would highly recommend going away and watching the documentary as well, and then checking you guys out on social media, because every time I see something you post, I get quite emotional. It really hits you, because I think our eyes have been closed to the fact, like you said, 1 in 5. People are not aware. There's no time in your life, or especially here in the UK, I'm not sure what it's like in other parts of the world, but we're not taught at school about animal rights. We're not taught at school about the fact there's many different varieties of fish. For instance, here in the UK, people just consume the same fish. It's cod, it's salmon, it's prawns, it's sardines, and what's another classic one I've missed? Probably mackerel. But, tuna around the world, right? Obviously, it's a problem. People don't know about the diverse state. So do you think there's any main marine wildlife that we should be really aware of that are endangered?
I think most people in the United Kingdom, most people in the United States, where I live, would never, ever think of consuming whale meat. They would never eat dolphin meat. They wouldn't eat sea turtle meat, and they wouldn't eat shark fin soup. And yet the reality is that when we consume fish, then we are contributing to the deaths of other species. It's what's known in the fishing industry as bycatch. Bycatch is the non-target species that the fishery ends up killing. I refer to them as the invisible victims of the fishing industry. So there are 7 species of sea turtle in the world. And out of those 7 species, 6 of them are either threatened or endangered. But there isn't really a single commercial fishery in the world that's targeting sea turtles. Sea turtle populations are falling because sea turtles are getting entangled in fishing gear. 1/3 of shark species are now endangered, and sharks are absolutely critical for regulating the health of marine ecosystems because they're an apex predator. We have concerns about whaling. Whaling is the reason I joined Sea Shepherd. I saw that image of that dead whale down in Antarctica. But while the whalers of Japan, Norway, and Iceland together kill around 3,000 whales annually, over 300,000 whales and dolphins are killed every single year through fishing gear entanglement, which means that industrial fishing is responsible for killing 100 times more whales and dolphins than all the whalers of the world combined. So if we're serious about addressing the real issues facing the world's oceans, we have to address the issue of industrial fishing. And Sea Shepherd's approach has been to go after the illegal operators because we already have the law on our side. And if we can get rid of illegal fishing, responsible for 20% of the global catch of fish, then we can reduce some of those overfishing pressures, allowing marine ecosystems to recover.
Yeah, which is really important, especially now we're looking at climate crisis. We're looking at so many threats for the ocean population. And you mentioned that your responsibility, or what you do, is obviously target those illegal operations. But why then, in that case, I mean, you might not be able to answer this, but why are the governments that are placing these laws not enforcing them themselves?
Well, there are 3 big challenges for law enforcement at sea. Sometimes it's a lack of political will. So sometimes a country has a big domestic industrial fishing industry that opposes stricter regulation. Sometimes it could be a matter of economic resources being stretched. So we work with a lot of developing countries that have a Coast Guard, they have a Navy, they have a police force, but they don't have the vessel asset that can get the law enforcers to the scene of the crime. So working with countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, the Gambia in West Africa, we've assisted our country partners to arrest 99 vessels for illegal fishing to date. Each one of those an illegal slaughterhouse shut down. And sometimes it's a matter of lack of jurisdiction. A lot of the world's oceans is the high seas, which means this is an area of water that's outside of any one country's national jurisdiction. And that means that the regulations are sparse and lacking.
Yeah, gosh, it's really tough. But what a feeling when you actually shut one of those down. Do you have kind of a team celebration? Is it just the best feeling?
It's an incredible feeling because of the amount of damage that one of these ships can do. So a vessel that's fishing illegally, like a ship called the Libico 2, this was a vessel that was legally licensed to fish for tuna using long line fishing gear in Liberia. But when we boarded that ship together with the Liberian Coast Guard, we discovered that this one vessel didn't have a single tuna on board. They didn't have a single long line hook on board either. They were using deep sea gill nets, which are essentially invisible curtains of death to catch deep sea sharks to produce shark liver oil for cosmetics. This one single ship was killing 500,000 sharks every single year for the production of shark liver oil. And the arrest of that vessel and its subsequent detention, that ship hasn't fished a single day since its arrest, has saved over 3 million sharks to date. And so those are the kind of successes that keep me going. For me, it's about criminal operations we can shut down and lives we're able to save. And through these campaigns, we've saved countless lives.
Yeah, it's absolutely remarkable to hear it, because if we're looking at the ocean preservation, I mean, you've mentioned obviously the threat of the ships and the people that are fishing illegally. I say destroying the ocean illegally, to be honest. What are the main threats that are out there for the ocean? For everyone listening, what are the main things that are causing so much damage at the moment?
Industrial fishing, being driven by illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. We have the problem of ocean pollution and plastic pollution in the world's oceans. And the majority of that plastic pollution actually being discarded fishing gear. And then, of course, we have climate change, which is the issue that makes every other issue worse. And you already mentioned that earlier, Rhi, climate change, climate change, climate change. This is what makes all of the other problems worse. In West Africa, where we're working, it's expected that by 2100, the amount of fish off the coast is likely to decrease by 90% due to climate change alone. And that's why we really need to remove these overfishing pressures so that these ecosystems can recover, so that there's ecological resilience for these fish populations to withstand the pressures of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, would you say, since obviously it's so important, we talk about climate change quite a bit on the Food for Thought podcast from a nutritional standpoint, which I think should encompass obviously the wealth and the health of the oceans. Let's be honest, we're all one big ecosystem on planet Earth. We need to all thrive together. What would you say, since the Seaspiracy documentary was made, would you say the message and the aim has changed a bit since then because of the new information we've had with climate change? You mentioned plastic. Have the figures changed drastically?
I'm not sure we're making tremendous progress in addressing climate change. It requires the governments of the world to join together to confront this existential issue. What does give me hope is seeing what maybe some individual countries are doing, countries like Gabon in Central Africa, where we work, who are protecting large swaths of rainforest, which do take up carbon. What we're seeing from cities, from mayors of major cities, maybe from individual states and counties taking action. I think what's been inspiring is what's being done on maybe more on a local level. And what's also being done on an individual consumer level. I think we're seeing people being more responsible in their day-to-day decisions. But I'm not sure we're seeing the big government changes that need to happen.
No. And I'm just wondering how long this can go on for. It's quite doom and gloom. But actually, when you said the changes that we can make on an individual level, that's really hopeful for people listening, because we've mentioned plastic. I do want to touch on it a bit. It is devastating to see something that we as human beings have consumed to be floating in the ocean, which can then kill an innocent creature. And you must witness it all the time.
All the time. If I'm working on a ferry going between Dover and Calais, and I throw a plastic bottle overboard, then that's an arrestable offense, causing plastic pollution. But you have an entire industry, the industrial fishing industry, that deliberately puts out plastic into the oceans designed to entangle wildlife. And within the economic calculus of that fishing activity is the knowledge that a lot of this fishing gear will be lost and not recovered. There was a ship that my crew and I chased for 110 days from Antarctica to West Africa, a ship called the Thunder.
Wow.
This was a ship that was fishing illegally for Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish down in the Southern Ocean. And because this vessel was fishing illegally, every fishing expedition, they would leave port with 600 kilometers of gill net on board their ship. They would go on about 3 fishing expeditions in a given year. And each time when they would return to port, the fishing gear was evidence of the crime. So they would get rid of that evidence at sea before they went into port. So here's just one ship out of tens of thousands of fishing vessels operating around the world. One ship, this one operating illegally, that every single year was discarding 1,800 kilometers of fishing net overboard. Proof of their crime, and net that would continue to drift as a ghost net and continue to entangle wildlife until it would finally wash ashore somewhere. So this is a major challenge. We've got an issue of microplastics in the ocean, and there's a lot more media coverage of that, thankfully. But macroplastics is a real problem as well. And the major contributor to macroplastics is industrial fishing.
Goodness me, it is so shocking. It's when you reveal those kind of stats, the kilometers involved, and I read somewhere it's like a garbage truck of plastic every single day is just being dumped into the ocean. You talk about chasing a ship, far. We're talking a hefty distance. What has been the most tremulous, dangerous experience, you've had on a ship? It can't all be, happy. I'm just going off on the ocean on my boat and I'm just going to go and track this one ship. I'm sure it's actually quite scary at times.
Well, probably what comes most to mind for me is this ship Thunder. This was a vessel that was wanted by the International Criminal Police Organization, Interpol. It had made an illicit profit of $60 million in its 10-year fishing career. It was wanted by 3 countries, and it was the subject of pretty much every fisheries conference, every sustainability conference around the world, and yet no government had seen this ship for about a decade. And so we set off to find it, to do the equivalent of a citizen's arrest, to follow the ship wherever it went, reporting on its location, hoping that some government somewhere would take over this arrest from us. I found the ship after just 2 days of searching in the most remote area of ocean in the world, a place called the Benzari Bank, about 2 weeks sailing from South Africa, 2 weeks sailing from Western Australia. And it was found in this heavy bank of fog off the Antarctic ice edge. 100 icebergs scattered in every direction, littering my radar screen. And the first thing that the Thunder tried to do was to lose us in the heavy ice flows that surround the Antarctic continent. And so for 24 hours, we pushed through ice big enough to sink a ship. And when they couldn't lose us, they tried to shake us in the heavy weather that the Southern Oceans are renowned for. So 8-9 meter seas beat and battered my ship as we pursued them north. It was after 110 days across 3 oceans covering 11,000 nautical miles that the captain of the ship, unable to shake us, decided to sink his own vessel in a bid to destroy the evidence on board. So the crew on my ship, the crew of our sister ship, had to rescue all 40 of the Thunder crew and hand them over to law enforcement. But these were criminals. This was a criminal enterprise making $60 million a year. With certain crew members involved in the narcotics trade as well. And so hitting them in their pocketbook certainly is dangerous. And encountering the natural challenges of being at sea in some of the most inhospitable areas of the world, that is a challenge as well.
To put it lightly, it really is. And they just sunk the whole ship. It just disappeared.
They sunk the whole ship to try to destroy the evidence on board. And because a lot of these fishing companies are owned by shell companies in secrecy jurisdictions to conceal who the actual legal owner is, the only reason we found out the real owner was that the insurance company that insured this ship called me about 2 months after the sinking and asked me if I'd ever heard of a ship called Thunder. I asked him, how much time do you have for me to tell this story? But the owner had made an insurance claim of $1.7 million for total loss of the vessel, including 35 tons of illegally caught fish. But that just shows how brazen these illegal operators are, how arrogant they are, that after sinking their own ship, they tried to claim insurance on it.
Oh my goodness, tell me that claim didn't go through, obviously.
It didn't go through ultimately because the captain and two of his officers were convicted for the crime of sinking the ship. They were sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. The company was fined 15 million euros. And so this was one of these rare victories in the fight against illegal fishing. It really sent a message to the owner and operator of that ship.
Absolutely. And hopefully to every other ship that's out there as well that have seen what's happened and know now that they're not going to get away with it for much longer, we hope.
Exactly
obviously.
Right. Because I look at crime, I look at fisheries crime from an economic lens. So people break the law when it's very lucrative, there's a big payoff, when there's a low risk of getting caught, and when the penalty for getting caught is also quite low. And unfortunately, illegal fishing ticks all three of those boxes. And so until the sentences are higher, until the repercussions are stronger, we're going to see this be a continued issue. This is the issue you see with ivory around the African continent, is that as long as ivory is trading at more money in value than cocaine, and the repercussion of getting caught with ivory over narcotics is lower, that people are going to traffic in wildlife.
Yeah. It's unbelievable that things still happen that you think, like you mentioned ivory as an example, it's something for me that's like, oh, in the past, but it's really not. Things still happen. They're under the radar because they're just not spoken about.
And that's how I felt about whaling until I learned that it was still happening. And then learning that actually, you know what, whaling isn't the main threat to whales. It's actually industrial fishing was that subsequent revelation. People know about poaching on the African continent. They know about the issue of the poaching of rhinos and elephants for ivory. But there's another kind of poaching that happens around the continent. It just happens at sea. When people think about poaching of African wildlife, they don't think of poaching of African marine wildlife. They don't think about sharks like the deep sea sharks taken by that ship Libico 2 off the coast of Liberia.
Yeah, no, goodness me. It just makes me feel a bit sick in my stomach, to be honest, when I think about the things that the human race do without any accountability. And I get it. I get that it's a really nuanced conversation. You know, it's complex and we're just kind of scraping the surface, hopefully raising a lot of awareness for my listeners that lots of things are happening under our noses all the time that we're just not really told about. So if you could give everybody listening your personal take on things that happen that apparently aren't illegal. So I've been watching a lot of the social media that you guys are putting out, and I'm also seeing on Seaspiracy. And is it the Faroe Islands and the huge mass killings that seem to be a cultural thing that happen all the time? I found it shocking. Why are we unable to stop that sort of thing happening?
Well, the Faroe Islands is a part of Denmark. They have home rule, so they're semi-independent, but they've been partaking in a dolphin drive hunt for the past 400 years, where when a pod or super pod of pilot whales migrates past these islands that are situated about halfway between the Shetland Islands and Iceland, people get into small boats and they drive them ashore. And as these pilot whales are driven up on the beach, they're slaughtered in mass. And it can be anywhere from a few dozen pilot whales to hundreds to over 1,000 pilot whales slaughtered in a single bloodbath. The Faroese say that it's for subsistence, that it's for maintaining their culture. But the Faroe Islands have one of the highest standards of living of any country in Europe. There are supermarkets, there are plant-based alternatives, there are many other alternatives to this hunt. It takes place in large part because it's been a cultural tradition for the Faroe Islands. And when people in the UK or people in the United States see these images, they're shocked to their core. The problem is that it's legal and it's cultural. And so the change has to come from within. It has to be the Faroese people who decide that this cruel practice belongs to the past.
Yes, exactly. A very, very difficult subject. And if we just park that for one moment and discuss the things that we're eating every single day, because I'm asked all the time, and it's fun, I was asked to write it in my previous 2 books, and I said I couldn't because I don't believe you can. But is there such a thing as ethical fishing? Or sustainable fishing, rather, if we actually turn it from ethical to sustainable fishing. And it's actually almost impossible to answer now, but I'd love to hear your take as someone that's far more knowledgeable on the subject than I.
Well, sustainability is a difficult term, right? Because it's so often been used as a corporate buzzword, and the oceans are already in a diminished state. So there are all of these accounts by fishing boat captains arriving off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in North America 300 years ago and writing in their ship logbooks that there is so much cod in the water that they could almost literally walk to shore from ship on the backs of cod, that a bucket could be thrown overboard, and as it's hauled up on deck, it would be overflowing with cod. That when they would make the transit from England to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, sometimes the ships would have to stop for a full 24 hours to allow for a whale and dolphin traffic jam to clear up. And we can't imagine an ocean that bountiful. These sound like tall fishermen's tales. They sound like they sound apocryphal. But there are so many of these accounts that they're probably true. It's just that we adapted to diminishment in the world's oceans. So I think before we can have a realistic discussion about what is sustainable, first we have to allow the oceans to rebound and recover to their natural state. And that's an ocean that's a lot more bountiful than it is today. In terms of ethics, I think it's 2 questions. There's the environmental ethics and there's the animal ethics. And I've been a vegan for 23 years, so I haven't eaten fish for 27 years. I haven't eaten any animal product for 23 years. But I also recognize that that's not a lifestyle that's achievable for everybody. We work in Liberia, for example, where we're fighting against illegal fishing, and that work helps benefit the local fishing communities who are artisanal fishing communities. Their livelihoods are threatened by industrial operators who are fishing in no-go zones. And for me, living in the city of Los Angeles, it's very easy to subscribe to a vegan diet. As a local fisherman in a remote community coastally in Liberia, I don't think it's for me to say that they shouldn't eat fish. But I know that I don't need to eat fish, and I choose not to. From an animal ethics standpoint, I think that fish get the least amount of attention of all animals. More than twice as many fish are killed as all other animals combined. And yet fish get the least amount of attention from animal rights organizations, animal welfare organizations. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is that they don't breathe. They breathe through gills. They don't breathe like us. So they don't have vocal cords. So their screams are silent, although they have the same capacity to suffer as you or I. It's very strange. One reason I think people don't give ethical consideration to fish is that they don't have eyelids. That seems like a very strange reason to not give ethical consideration to another creature. But the thing that we have in common with other mammals is that we have eyelids and eyelashes and eyebrows, and we blink. Fish don't. And there's an interesting story of Disney Pixar as they were making the film Finding Nemo. They hired the best marine biologists, the best animal behavioralists to make the animated avatars as realistic as their real-life cousins as possible. But the one thing they added was eyelids to Nemo, eyelids to all the fish, because they felt that the audience wouldn't be able to relate to them or empathize with those creatures if they couldn't blink. It sounds like a crazy thing. We're killing fish in large numbers because they don't have eyelids, but that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. And then I also think there's a level of abstraction to it. So the fishing industry will talk about fishing in terms of not netting or hooking fish. They talk about harvesting fish as if they're being picked off the trees like apples. They don't talk about fish populations. They talk about fish stock as if they're being removed from shelves off of warehouses. And we never talk about the number of fish being killed. We always talk about fish in terms of tonnage. So in one sentence, you could say 50 ton of fish stock was harvested. So it's not surprising that people don't feel any kind of real relationship with the fish that they're consuming.
Yeah, it's very different if you said slaughtered, right, with an animal versus harvested versus farmed, or however you want to describe it. It's just for anyone listening, the reason I wrote the plant-based nutrition book is because, like you were quite rightly saying, Peter, it's not an option for everybody to go vegan, but the world needs to recover from the damage that we as human beings have done by compensating and farming en masse, which originally obviously came from a place of, let's create food security, but now has completely backfired and flipped 360. And what you can do, to everyone listening, is reduce. If you are somebody that consumes daily animal produce, you can still consume it, but please have a lot less of it, is the message of the book I just wrote. It's try and have more plants. And for anyone that's vegan, great, you're doing a huge contribution to the planet, but it's not going to be for everybody. And what we need to just get a message out there. And I can't quite understand why, when all the literature, this is my little rant, by the way, Peter, it's not, I just can't understand and fathom why we have countless data now that dictates the biggest thing we can do on an individual level is reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the diet we consume, less animal produce. We can still have it in smaller amounts if that is your preference. To anyone listening, just have more plants and we'll all be healthier and happier for it. Yet it doesn't seem to be at the top of any agenda in any government to be ploughing forward that message. And when it comes to the oceans, you're quite right, completely forgotten about. It's like there's a huge disconnect from what happens on land. And what happens out there is still like the Titanic, the great big unknown of the ship that sunk. That's how I think people really see the foodscape in the ocean. And to anyone that eats tuna listening, I just urge you to stop, because there's so many other varieties of fish you could be consuming. And I say that all the time. That's my little rant. I'm just going back.
I think you're spot on. I think the issue is sometimes the problems feel so insurmountable that people don't even know where to begin. But you have to begin with yourself and the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis. That's number one. That's the first thing any one of us can do. But secondly, I think when we're communicating about these issues, and I do this myself, it's hard to convey the issue when the numbers and statistics are so big that you can't even wrap your head around it. So I can say 73 to 100 million sharks are killed every single year, but that number is so huge that how does a person even imagine a number that big? I think you have to take it down to that individual level, both in the consumer choices people make, but to also talk about how these decisions affect individual animals with their own complex lives, their own social structures. There's in the Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, there's the saying of, if you save one life, you can save the world. I think we have to get back to that as well in guiding our day-to-day decisions. Saving one life, that is a good enough deed.
Yeah, I agree. And be a bit more connected to the food system to understand that I always ask myself a question, could I do this to achieve the food that's there in the packet for me on the shop shelves? And sometimes I question that. I know not everybody has the luxury or the privilege to be able to have those type of thoughts, actually. They've got to put food on the table for their family. We're talking about a really big nuanced conversation around food, dietary preferences, the psychology of nutrition. It's all very tough. It's a huge, tough ball you just want to unravel of string. But really, we do not have any idea what goes on in the production chain of food. Like you've just said about all the illegal parts that are happening in the ocean that people had no idea about, perhaps until listening to this podcast now. And then they might see the item of food on the shop shelves and think, well, how did that get there? So how can people guarantee that the items on the shelves that they're consuming are the legal options? Is there anything consumers can do to look out for that?
First of all, I have a lot of faith in people. So I genuinely believe that people, when presented with the right information, will make the ethical and right choice. I really believe that. There are a lot of markings for sustainable certification of different projects, but a lot of those markings are flawed. There's a financial incentive behind some of these sustainable certification schemes where the fishing companies themselves are paying to get this certification. So if the certification society doesn't at least certify some of the fisheries, then there's no business model at all. So that's something that needs to be considered. I think when it comes to the food we eat, unless we know the farmer, unless we know the person, there's going to be, if the food is exchanged many hands, it's going to be less clear where that food came from. I think the best thing people can do is eat locally to the best of their ability, and that's not always possible. And it's one of the big challenges in the plant-based space as well, is that we need plant-based food to be cheaper. It needs to be cheaper to make the healthy option, because people will choose to do the right thing, but they'll also choose what's the most affordable. And people are really struggling in Europe, in the United States, economically. People want to make the right choice, but we also have to make it easier to make that right choice.
100%, which is why, but I do believe plant-based diets are more accessible for people than saying straight away, go vegan or do this or do that, because it can incorporate a change that everybody can realistically make. Now, many governments, Peter, especially in the UK as well, I know they talk about this a lot. They say that surrounding waters are safeguarded, so they're protected, marine protected areas, and it makes us feel, oh, that's a nice feeling, you know. There's these areas and these patches of sea. Obviously, they're minuscule in the grand schemes of how huge the ocean is. But how effective is this? So the MPAs, the protected areas?
The marine protected areas are as effective as the legislation is strong and as the enforcement is there. So we understand the value of national parks on land, whether it's Yellowstone National Park in the United States, whether it's Brecon Beacons in Wales. We understand the purpose that national parks fill on land in terms of safeguarding natural areas, in terms of allowing wildlife populations to recover, allowing rewilding. We need the same thing to happen at sea. And presently, only 3% of the world's oceans are marine protected area. And of that 3%, just a small fraction is actually a no-take zone where no industrial fishing is allowed whatsoever. There's a global push on the United Nations level to set aside 30% of the world's oceans as marine protected area by 2030. That's a big, big challenge, considering that we only have 6 years to go to reach that commitment. When 30% of the world's oceans get protected, the question will be protected to what level, to what extent? Will this be a no-take zone? Will only certain types of fishing activity will be banned? Is it a matter of, okay, you're allowed to fish here, but there's a reduced quota? What's the science on which that quota will be based? And also in especially remote places like the Antarctic, who's going to enforce those laws? We're struggling to enforce the laws against illegal fishing in the waters of countries as it is. How do we do it in high seas areas where no one single government is responsible? So the marine protected areas are huge. It's something we have to create, but we have to set them right to begin with. And that means no take and also a plan for how to enforce it. We need to make sure these aren't just paper tigers.
No, absolutely. And less than 3% is just not a big enough percentage when you say that out loud. We had a stat the other day on the podcast that in terms of mammal mass on the planet, less than 4% are now wildlife. And you just think, how have we got to a point where 60-something% is agriculture, farmed animals, and 4% wildlife? We really need to look at these figures, guys, and start acting on it and just being more and more aware. So what is next for Sea Shepherd? What is the next thing that you're really saying? Look, everyone, we're going to shout about this. We need your support. This is what we need to do.
So we're continuing to work with our partner countries around the African continent to arrest illegal fishing vessels, but we're also taking that program and expanding it to other parts of the world. Earlier this year, I was in Tuvalu in the South Pacific, a small island state. The country itself is about 26 square kilometers of land area, but their ocean area is over 900,000 square kilometers. The country of Tuvalu had a patrol vessel that was damaged in a cyclone, which was the result of rising sea temperatures and climate change. And so for the past year, there's been no patrolling capacity at sea. So we brought our ship there. We had the Tuvalu police service on board our vessel, and we patrolled, confiscating illegal fishing gear, releasing animals from hooks, bringing violators to justice. And we're looking to expand that to other partners in the region as well. We're also highlighting the issue of the krill fishery down in the Antarctic. So there are between 12 or 14 super trawlers, each one of them with a fish hold big enough to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. dragging nets big enough to swallow a jumbo jet. And they're going down to the Antarctic to fish for krill, a small shrimp-like crustacean about 2 to 6 centimeters in length, and the foundational species for the entire Antarctic ecosystem, the primary food source for fin whales, humpback whales, many species of penguins. And these krill are being vacuumed out of the oceans in order to produce omega-3 health food supplements, primarily, for which there are plant-based alternatives. And we're trying to shine a light on that particularly destructive and completely unnecessary fishery. This isn't a matter of food security or anything like this. This is completely unnecessary. The reason why krill have omega-3 in their bodies is they get it from phytoplanktons. The reason why fish have omega-3 in their bodies is that they get it from algae and planktons. We can cut out the middle fish. We can cut out the middle krill. We can go straight to the source and get it from the same foundational source, which is these greens.
I know, and then grow more of what we've just taken because we're taking the plant version. It's so wild to me to think that this omega-3 excuse, because we know about it, as a nutritional scientist myself, we know you get the algae from the main source. It's also a more superior supplement. There's so many problems with cod liver oil supplements, of krill supplements, the quality, everything. It just makes no sense. So that's devastating to hear. So I'm really getting behind you on that, and hopefully we can shine a light on that. Do people donate to Sea Shepherd? How does that work?
They can go onto our website, SeaShepherdsGlobal.org. They can become a monthly donor, which is how we're able to actually budget for these campaigns. They can become a volunteer. Most of our crew on our ships are volunteers. And so we encourage those who have particular skills to join, but also those who maybe don't have any maritime experience, but maybe they're a nutritional scientist and they can assist with the health of our crew from the galley. All the food served on board our ships are plant-based.
I know, because you guys have a cookbook. Sorry to interject. You have a cookbook, don't you?
No, not at all. We do. We have a couple of cookbooks out and highlight some of the favorite meals for the crews on board, which includes, of course, a vegan shepherd's pie for the Sea Shepherd crew.
Amazing. I absolutely love that. It's been a good chat, and I want to get some listener questions in because our listeners always comment with different things, and I thought that these would be perfect for you. Leanne has said, what backlash did you get from being involved with the Seaspiracy documentary? Because at the time, I remember it was just huge. It had huge controversy. There were lots of for and against features, the media frenzy.
Well, Leanne, it's a great question, but actually, we didn't have any negative feedback. Rather, to the contrary, we saw substantial growth in the organization in terms of support we were getting from the public. We were able to bring attention to the campaigns we were doing off the coast of West Africa with our partner countries, and we were able to bring that to millions and millions of homes around the world. So for us, it's just been positive. We saw increased support for Sea Shepherd's work.
I love that. That's fantastic. And this actually leads on to it. Sam has said, are there any success stories of marine wildlife recovery that you give hope for the future? I mean, you did, of course, mention earlier as well that with every one life saved, you're saving lots more. But is there any particular success story that you...
Well, when we started working in Liberia in West Africa, there's a small border town between Liberia and neighboring Cote d'Ivoire called Harper. And this has this big, small-scale fishing community. And every single night, foreign industrial trawlers were coming in. They were covering up the names of their boats with nets. They were running over local fishing nets. They were running over local fishing canoes. And members of the communities stopped coming home. People were drowning at sea. As there's fewer fish, these local fishing communities have to go further offshore, sometimes 12, 15 miles, sometimes 30 miles from land in a small open canoe to fish ever declining numbers of fish. But these industrial trawlers are coming in. They were running over canoes. They were killing people. The local fishermen appealed to the Ministry of Defense to mobilize the Coast Guard to stop these incursions, but the Coast Guard, with its small vessel assets, didn't have the range and endurance to reach the border. And that's when we came in. So we brought the Liberian Coast Guard on board. Within 24 hours of being on that border, we helped make the first arrest. We've made 5 arrests on that border, and now the incursions have stopped altogether.
Wow.
And the local fishermen are talking about the fishing populations coming back. And older fishermen, the fathers and grandfathers of fishermen, talk about seeing fish bigger than what they've seen since childhood memory. So that's a big success. And it shows what can happen if you're on the water enforcing the law.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, stories like that. We need this. There is still hope. And I think it's so important for people to realize that we can make such a difference. Fact or fiction round, Peter. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay. Right. If you could answer fact or fiction to the following questions. Number 1, the ocean is home to up to 80% of life on Earth.
That's fact. And also a lot of the life that we haven't discovered yet. So species are being uncovered in the oceans all the time. We're looking for life in the outer reaches of space, and we still haven't discovered all the life in our oceans. More people have landed on and walked on the moon than have reached the deepest depths of the ocean in the Marianas Trench.
Wow, crazy. It's ethical to eat any type of fish as long as it's wild.
I think we talked about this earlier. For me, the decision that I've made living in Los Angeles is that ethically, I don't eat fish. If the audience member who may have asked that question is from a local fishing community in Liberia, then I leave that for them to make that decision.
Yeah, very fair. In the United States, 1 in 3 wild fish caught is captured illegally.
False. That's a statistic that is related to import data. So the U.S. Treasury Department said about 5-10 years ago that about 1/3 of the fish imported into the United States was likely caught through illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The number that's agreed upon internationally is about 20% of the global catch, although it's a dark figure. How do you quantify a black market? It's like putting a number on the amount of cocaine or weapon trafficking or oil smuggling. Because it's a dark market, we don't really know.
Yeah. The policies currently in place by governments is enough to save our marine wildlife.
I would say false. I say that the policies that exist are not properly implemented and oftentimes aren't enforced, and we need to see the creation of more marine protected areas. So we need more legal frameworks.
Absolutely. Fishing has wiped out 90% of the world's large fish.
That's true of certain areas. So it's certainly true of, if you look at the Mediterranean, which is the most overfished body of water in the world, which has 10% the amount of fish that it had 50 years ago.
Whoa, that's huge. That's crazy. At a personal level, there's nothing we can do to help this issue.
Absolutely false. I think change begins with you. I think it's amazing what a small group of people is able to do. We talked about a ship called the Thunder earlier, a vessel that the governments of the world were hand-tied to do anything about in 10 years, but then a small group of passionate people, supported by compassionate people around the world, were able to stop that ship. No, it's amazing what people can do when they put their minds to it.
Exactly. 70% of macroplastic at sea comes from fishing gear.
That's true.
For every 1 dolphin captured, 12 more are killed.
I'd say that's fiction because I believe it's actually greater than that. And that's probably focused on the dolphin slaughter in Taiji, Japan. There was an Academy Award-winning film called The Cove, which was about that issue. And I think it was almost twice as many dolphins that are slaughtered for every 1 dolphin brought into captivity from that particular place.
Oh my goodness. Enforcing better laws around marine conservation and overfishing is too difficult, and that's why governments haven't done it yet.
Fiction? It's true and false. Jurisdiction is an issue. Political will is an issue. Economic resources are an issue. We talked about all 3 of those things a bit earlier.
Yeah. 93% of all carbon is stored in the ocean.
I believe that's true. And that's one of the big challenges of bottom trawling, which is the equivalent of bulldozing the seabed to catch fish. And that allows for carbon that's stored in the seabed to once again be released to the atmosphere.
Which adds again to our issue of global climate change and everything that's happening. What an amazing, informative fact or fiction round. Honestly, Peter, you're a fountain of knowledge. There's been so many stats. I'm just thinking I wish I could write them all down and just have them to hand. I'll have to listen back to the episode and just memorize everything. So whenever I'm in an interview somewhere, could be like, oh, did you know that 10% is left after 50 years in the Mediterranean Sea? You know, it's all this type of stuff that is just so important for our listeners to know. And I want to wrap up the episode just by thinking, well, we finish with a food for thought, but just thinking that we can make a difference. And like you said, I think what's so inspiring about the Sea Shepherd story and the audience that, like, I was drawn to it from watching Seaspiracy, it changed my views as well on how I ate, the way I live. I think it just takes a few passionate individuals, like you said, and if they can get the support behind them, they can recruit more passionate individuals, and it will just spread, and it will spread like a ripple effect. And I've always believed in that we can do something. So my take-home message to everyone listening is, please don't feel fear-mongered or overwhelmed. Let's just look at the fact that we're put on this earth, and we do just need to take care of what we can and what's in our control at our fingertips to do so. If you could leave our listeners with a food for thought, Peter, what would that be?
I would say that saving the life for a single creature really does matter. When I joined Sea Shepherd, I joined at the age of 18. So I joined it with this youthful naivety that I was setting sail on a ship to save the world. And my first action that I ever took for marine wildlife, we'd sailed into the Galapagos Marine Reserve. And within just a few hours of arriving, we came across our first illegal long line, about 8 miles in length. And we started hauling it aboard the ship. And the crew were ecstatic because we'd spent 6 months in port getting the ship ready for sea. And finally, we were taking some real direct action to save marine wildlife. And I remember at the age of 18, feeling almost a little discouraged because we were pulling up 8 nautical miles of long line, but I knew that there was enough long line set in any given night to wrap around the circumference of the earth 500 times. So what does 8 miles matter? But my job that night was to cut the hooks from the line and to put them in a bucket at my feet. And 2-3 hours into the hauling, I remember holding one of these hooks in my hand and watching it gleam under the moonlit night and thinking, this one hook isn't going to kill a dolphin or a shark or an albatross or a sea turtle or a tuna that night. This one hook is not. It would have had we not pulled it out of the sea, but it will not. And to think that that doesn't make a difference is incredibly anthropocentric. It's incredibly human-centered, and it's incredibly me-centered, because at the end of the day, that one single action made the biggest difference for that one animal's life. It was the difference between life or death. And we pulled up hundreds and hundreds of hooks that night. And so I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. If you can save a life, you can save the entire world. And when I went out to sea, it was with that naivety that I was going to set sail to save the world. And I came to realize that one person can't save the entire world, but you can save the entire world for one individual animal. That has to matter. And as we focus on the big scale issues, it's those little victories that aren't actually little victories because they're huge victories for the animals that we need to celebrate on a daily basis because they really matter. They matter to the animals. They matter to me. I know they matter to you. They certainly matter to Sea Shepherd.
That was a beautiful food for thought. Thank you. Peter, where can everyone go to learn more? Where can we direct everybody to go and look into all of this?
I encourage people to go on to SeaShepherdGlobal.org. You can follow us on Instagram or other social media channels for Sea Shepherd. If you want to become a volunteer or crew on our ships, you can find an application form there. And if you have an interest in food and cooking, you can find a spot in our galley where I'm sure you'll see your cookbook in the very near future, because I'll make sure that I bring one to the ship when I rejoin my crew.
Oh, how amazing. Peter, thank you so much for coming on Food for Thought.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much, and thank you for all you do.